want to extend a very special thanks to these groups and to all the individual students who have worked very hard to broaden the boundaries of the campus discourse by bringing speakers like Noam Chomsky and earlier Art Spiegelman. All of us appreciate your initiative, your efforts, and your imagination. Following the talk, there will be some time for questions. There's a microphone in the center aisle, and you are invited just to come forward to it. Please try to be concise. Following the question period, you are cordially invited to continue the discussion informally in Linner Lounge, which is in the student room next to the chapel. In his newly published biography of Noam Chomsky, subtitled A Life of Dissent, Robert Barsky opens with these lines, and I quote, "The task of writing a biography of Noam Chomsky gives new meaning to the word daunting. Chomsky is one of this century's most important figures and has been described as one who will be for future generations what Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Mozart, or Picasso have been for ours. He is the most cited living person. 4,000 citations are listed in the Arts and Humanities Citation Index in the years 1980, 1992. And he is 8th on the short list, which includes the likes of Marx and Freud, of the most cited figures of all time." End quote. No less daunting, then, obviously, is the task of adequately introducing Noam Chomsky this evening. It is my privilege and pleasure to try. Now some 20 years after I first heard his clear words in the community church on the campus of Boston University. In a 1992 interview published in Rolling Stone, Chomsky observed, quote, "The norm is that if you subordinate yourself to the interests of the powerful, whether it's a parent, teacher, or anybody else, and if you do it politely and willingly, you'll get ahead. If you've resisted the temptation to tell the teacher you're an asshole, which maybe he or she is, and if you don't say, that's idiotic, when you get a stupid assignment, you will gradually pass through all the required filters. Let's say you're a student in school, and the teacher says something about American history, and it's so absurd, you feel like laughing." He must be talking about high school history courses, I'm sure. "I remember this as a child. If you get up and say, that's really foolish, nobody could believe that. The facts are the other way around. You're going to get in trouble." As a libertarian anarchist and radical activist for more than 50 years, Noam Chomsky has repeatedly said and repeatedly gotten into trouble for saying, that's foolish. The facts are the other way around. Whether speaking out against American foreign policy, nationalism, authoritarian structures of oppression at home and abroad, or the causes and effects of government and corporate-controlled media, to name just a few of the amazingly numerous, though interconnected political issues that have engaged him, Chomsky has been consistently unwavering and unsparing in his dissent. He is, of course, as he would be the first to acknowledge, by no means unique or alone in such dissent, not even in the current climate reaction. There are many others, most of them unknown or little known. And yet, how many radicals, even prominent radicals, here or anywhere, have also revolutionized the field of knowledge and study numerous times over, in his case, the field of linguistics? How many have also written more than 70 books and more than 1,000 articles in, for example, linguistics, philosophy, politics, cognitive sciences, and psychology? How many have also held the title of Institute Professor, an honor bestowed on Professor Chomsky at age 47 by his home institution, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT? How many have also won the Kyoto Prize in Basic Science, Japan's equivalent to the Nobel Prize? Noam Chomsky was born in Philadelphia in 1928. Reared in a household headed by Hebrew scholars and educators, he eventually went on to earn a PhD in linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a member of the MIT faculty since 1955. One of his friends succinctly sums up his contributions to linguistics this way: all the branches of modern linguistics stem from his work. In short, Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, is that still too rare and always endangered exotic hyphenate, radical, activist, intellectual, scientist. His rich life, in all its multiple facets, bears inspiring witness to the challenges and rewards of passionate, tireless engagement on an astonishingly wide range Moreover, it offers convincing proof, at least to me, that the great neighborhood radical activist Saul Alinsky was right when he argued that engagement in radical activism is the only sure fountain of youth. Toward the end of his biography, Barsky recounts the following moment during a lively 1990 conversation between Chomsky and others in a suburban Glasgow pub. Somebody, Barsky writes, recalls Václav Havel's dictum that, quote, truth and love will triumph over hatred and lies. Chomsky's response? It's a nice thought. Yes, but is it true or false? Neither, Chomsky replies. It could become true to the extent that people struggle to make it come true. Citizen and professor, radical and intellectual, and so much more, please welcome Noam Chomsky to St. Peter to say this.
Richest and most powerful country in the world by far. Its policies have an enormous impact on what happens in the world. No other actors in the state system even come close. Furthermore, by comparative standards, the country is very free, and most of us are highly privileged, even by the standards of this uniquely privileged society, with its completely unparalleled advantages. Under these conditions, we can not only influence U.S. policy, but we can also act in other ways, quite outside of governmental channels. I'm going to keep to the governmental channels because of their paramount importance in the case of the United States, but I want to stress that these are by no means exhaustive. The options are none. If we're serious about using the opportunities that we have open to us, we have to begin by gaining as clear a picture as we can of the reality. That's the other word in the title. In this case, that means asking the question, just what is the commitment of the United States government to human rights in the past and today? Now, at this point, we can proceed along two quite different paths. We have to make a choice. The simplest choice is to take the U.S. government commitment to human rights to be given. It's unchallengeable. Either it's a fact so obvious that the questions need not even be entertained, or maybe it's even true in principle, so it's immune to fact. If we decide to take that path, then the questions that open up are why is the world, or at least parts of the world, how come they don't join us in our noble crusade for human rights? And then the corollary, how can we raise others to our standards of nobility? And then for enemies, we have various devices, embargoes, sanctions, terror, bombardment, and so on. For friends and clients who don't live up to our standards, more subtle means. Well, there's an alternative course that could be taken, far more controversial, even condemned as irrational or extremist or emotional. That is to take the United States commitment to human rights to be a question of fact, as in the case of every other state of past and present history, and we then pursue a different course of inquiry. We inquire into the actual record at home and abroad, past and present,
And if we discover that it's the commitment to human rights is, say, less than perfect, we can ask what can be done to modify or to improve U.S. policy. Well, those are the two options before pursuing both of them. I want to tarry for a moment on a side question, a kind of moral truism. And I apologize to you for spending a little time on a truism, but it's often forgotten, so worth a word of mention. The truism is that people who regard themselves as moral agents are concerned primarily with the consequences of their own actions. In this domain, that translates to the conclusion that they're going to focus concern for human rights on their own state and its allies and clients quite generally. Now, that's an elementary principle. We understand it very well when we consider enemies. So, for example, we do rightly admire Soviet or Libyan dissidents who condemn the crimes of their own states, and in the Soviet case, their satellites. Suppose they were to condemn American or Israeli or British crimes. They might well be right, but the moral value of these condemnations, which incidentally are quite typical of the former Soviet and Libyan press, the moral value of those would be very slight, perhaps even negative in context, even if the condemnations were accurate. Well, that's a simple principle, and in a more democratic society, its force extends. It holds, for pretty obvious reasons, the responsibility of a citizen for state action is far greater in the case of a more democratic society, and along with it, the moral duty to focus attention and energy on those acts. Well, again, I think that all that is truisms, but let me nevertheless illustrate just to sharpen up the point. So take a concrete example. At Yale University Law School, there's a project called the Cambodia Genocide Program. It's an excellent program producing very good work. The mandate of the program, I'm quoting it, is to bring to justice those responsible for the crimes committed by the DK government, the Democratic Kampuchea government, that's the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime, within Cambodia from April 17th, 1975 to January 1979, when the atrocities were in fact terminated by a Vietnamese invasion in response to a Cambodian invasion of Vietnam. The Vietnamese invasion, incidentally, which terminated the atrocities, was bitterly denounced by the United States, and it led to punishment of Vietnam for its crime in ridding Cambodia of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, while the United States lent its support to the Pol Pot government, the Democratic Kampuchea government, driven to Thailand, and the official reason was that we supported it because of its, I'm quoting the State Department, because of its continuity with the Pol Pot regime, State Department explained. Incidentally, this may be about the only example of a humanitarian intervention in history, at least the only one I can think of. Not that it was undertaken for humanitarian purposes, it wasn't at all, but it happened to have humanitarian consequences, and it led to 10 years of very harsh embargo and punishment for the people who had dared to do it while we supported the government that they had overthrown, the Pol Pot government. So going back to the Cambodia project, it focuses very sharply on crimes in Cambodia from April 17th, 1975, when the Khmer Rouge took over, until January 1979, when they were driven out. One of the program reports observes that that period covered one of the worst cases of genocide and crimes against humanity ever perpetrated. Legal specialists associated with the project are tentatively believe, at least they're exploring grounds, for culpability so that the search for justice can proceed, perhaps in some kind of international tribunal. Well, in exactly the same years, in the same region of the world, the worst slaughter of population, relative to population since the Holocaust, was being carried out, in this case in an act of direct aggression, condemned as such by the United Nations Security Council, so unanimous vote, I'm not giving my opinion. It led to the slaughter of about maybe a quarter or a third of the population. It is the clearest and most extreme case of war crimes and crimes against humanity since World War II. And surely, to quote the Cambodia report, it is one of the worst cases of genocide and crimes against humanity ever perpetrated. In fact, in addition to that, a war crime of aggression, which is even more serious than crimes against humanity in the international system. The perpetrator of that particular crime was General Suharto of Indonesia, a highly valued U.S. client. He is our kind of guy, the Clinton administration observed when they welcomed him to Washington a couple of years ago. He took power in Indonesia 30 years ago, conducting a huge slaughter as he took power, compared by the CIA to the crimes of Hitler and Stalin. In fact, it was rather like what just happened in Rwanda. This crime, incidentally, aroused extraordinary euphoria in the United States over what was called the boiling bloodbath and the staggering mass slaughter of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, within a few months. I'm quoting the very enthusiastic reactions in Time and the New York Times, but it was quite general. It really has to be read to be believed. I've reviewed it if you're interested in print. It's bound to disappear from history. It's just too embarrassing, though it's all straight out in public. The United States government claimed credit for helping the achievement at the time and was even more decisively involved in one of the worst cases of genocide and crimes against humanity when its favorite mass murderer invaded East Timor in 1975. The invasion took place. It was known in advance that the invasion was going to take place. We know that from leaked diplomatic cables, mostly from Australia. The invasion took place a few hours after Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford, President Ford, were in Jakarta. They delayed it a few hours so as to not embarrass them too much. At the time, 90% of Indonesian arms were from the United States under a treaty which allowed them to be used only for self-defense. There was a United Nations Security Council condemnation. The United States declared an arms embargo officially, but it did it so secretly that the Indonesians never heard about it, and they were particularly surprised to learn about it later, because as soon as the embargo was called, the United States sent new shipments of counterinsurgency equipment, including aircraft and others. Something that was combined with diplomatic support, I should say. The diplomatic support was described in his memoirs by the U.S. UN ambassador, that's Daniel Patrick Moynihan, now senator from New York, and very highly lauded as a leading exponent of international law. He writes in his memoirs that the State Department wanted things to turn out as they did, and I was given the responsibility of ensuring that of rendering the United Nations utterly ineffective in any action that it might take to stop the aggression, and I carried this out with considerable success. Then goes on to say in the first few weeks, about 10% of the population was slaughtered, a crime which he compares, not I, to the crimes of the Nazis in Eastern Europe, and then goes on to the next topic. The slaughter continued. It picked up by 1977. Indonesia, which is a big country, was actually, and with a big army, was actually running out of arms in the attack against the Timorese. The Carter administration escalated the flow of arms so that they could consummate the massacre. It kind of reached its peak in 1978, still goes on and still continues. As many of you know, the Nobel Peace Prize was just given to two Timorese, Bishop Bello from Timor, and José Ramos Horta represents the resistance abroad. Well, that's the basic story of that crime, which still continues. And it was the same period, notice. The worst part of it was the same period as the Pol Pot regime, same region of the world. Of course, it continues afterwards, and it's different in that it was also a war crime, not just crimes against humanity. That is aggression, a much more serious crime. Well, in this case, there's no thought of punishment or even of inquiry, though the scale is comparable to Pol Pot, and the legal basis in this case is transparent. You don't have to search it. Aggression is an outright crime, the worst crime, explicitly so designated in all international conventions, including the UN Charter and so on. Furthermore, not only is the legal basis transparent, but it's not all that hard to bring the people responsible to justice. For example, it's possible to find out where Henry Kissinger is, or Jimmy Carter, or Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and quite a long list of others. And it wouldn't even be that hard to find General Suharto and many others involved. Actually, I should say some of them have been brought to justice in an odd sort of way. There was a big massacre in East Timor in Dili in November 1991, I guess it was. Hundreds of Timorese were murdered by Indonesian troops during a memorial. The murder was in a cemetery when they were, it was a peaceful demonstration going to the cemetery where the earlier first Timorese had been killed a couple of weeks earlier. This one actually became public. The Indonesians made a technical error. They didn't know it, but there was a British freelance journalist hiding behind one of the gravestones, and he filmed it, which is a bad mistake. You're not, and those of you who are planning on a diplomatic career, you're not supposed to carry out massacres in front of television cameras. It's a little word of advice. They also made a second mistake. They practically beat two American reporters to death. It's true that they were dissident reporters, freelance reporters, Alan Nairn and Amy Goodman, but even that's not considered right. So that sort of made it did become a big public issue. And then after a massacre, if you make a technical mistake like that, there's a routine that you go through. You go to your public relations firm in New York, and they tell you how to do it. You run an inquiry into this, aberration, and you find out that a couple of low-level soldiers, some sergeant or somebody, disobeyed orders, and you put him in jail for a couple of months. Meanwhile, the protesters, the ones who survived, are sent for life sentences and so on for defaming the state and that sort of thing. And then there's a chorus of approval from all over the world for your magnificence and having investigated your own crimes and so on and so forth. And then things go back to normal. That's the routine. A lot of examples. This was one. Well, one of the things they did, the Indonesians, they figured they'd better, the general in charge, they figured it'd be a good idea to get him away for a while. So he was sent off to Harvard. Harvard has a program that trains sort of third world killers and teaches them how to drink port and be nice guys and that sort of thing. And this guy was sent off there. I'd actually heard about it from activists in Australia, this big Timor group in Australia. They told me this was happening. So I told some local people in Boston. They went to Harvard. Harvard said they never heard of him. They then discovered where he was living, and began picketing outside his house. And that led to my favorite headline ever in an American newspaper, I guess. The Boston Globe had a story headlined, Indonesian General Flees Boston. That's what he went back, they took him away real fast. He was then, the Center for Constitutional Rights then brought charges against him. There's the way in U.S. courts to charge people for atrocities committed elsewhere if you get somebody here who, has standing was affected by it. They brought charges since he had fled. He didn't defend himself. He was brought to a Boston federal court and charged $14 million. So there was some punishment. The same routine happened exactly the same way a year earlier with General Gramajo of Guatemala, this guy, really major killer. Same story, I won't go into that one. So there's sometimes punishment, but sort of in exotic and imaginative ways. Anyway, the reach of justice comes close to home and would not be hard to pursue in this case. However, and this is my point, there is no Timor genocide program at Yale University or anywhere else. It's not the character of the crimes that differentiates the two cases that I mentioned. It's rather the agency. That's pretty clear, and that generalizes quite widely. Well, you can see it even more clearly, perhaps, if you look more closely at Cambodia. There actually is one official governmental inquiry into the Khmer Rouge crimes, namely an inquiry carried out by the government of Finland. The Finnish government study is entitled Decade of Genocide, 1969 to 1979. Notice 1969 to 1979, not April 1975 to 1979. Well, why the difference between the Finnish government inquiry and the Yale program? It's actually quite simple. From 1969 to 1975, Cambodia was subjected to perhaps the most intense bombing of civilian society in history. Again, direct aggression and a huge cost. The CIA estimates in their demographic survey of this period 600,000 dead in that phase of the decade of the genocide. And high U.S. officials in 1975, when the Khmer Rouge took over, high U.S. officials predicted that another 1 million people would die from the lasting consequences. About 100,000 were dying a year in just Phnom Penh alone at that time. And they also predicted that at least 2 years of slave labor would be required, that's their term, to deal with the effects of that. Well, not much is known about that period, the 1969 to 1975 period, and in fact the Finnish government report only has a few pages on it because there isn't much evidence. Most of the evidence is on the 75 to 79 period. It's not because it would have been hard to find out what was happening. In fact, it would have been quite easy, a lot easier than for 75 to 79, when you had to trek to the Thai-Cambodian border to try to find refugees and that sort of thing. So take, for example, the man who's well-known as the conscience of the American press, Sidney Schanberg. He received that title for his exposure of Khmer Rouge crimes, that is, in the proper time frame, 75 to 79. He actually happened to have been the New York Times correspondent in Cambodia at the peak of the U.S. bombing. This was, of course, U.S. bombing. He and his colleagues would not have had to trek to the Thai-Cambodia border to find refugees in order to, don't have to go through the jungle to find out what was going on and to get refugee testimony. It would only have been necessary to cross the street from their hotel in Phnom Penh, capital of Cambodia, where there were over 1 million refugees who had fled from the U.S. terror bombing that was destroying inner Cambodia, and incidentally was also mobilizing the Khmer Rouge, who barely existed before this, as the director of the Yale program has documented in his own important scholarly investigations. But that story is useless, or worse, so very little is known about this period, and there's also no further inquiry, let alone any thought of pursuing culpability. Well, that illustrates the moral truism, and what it really illustrates is that we consistently violate it. Not just we, so does everyone, but I'm concerned with us. We consistently act in direct contradiction to what is, in fact, the moral truism. These examples illustrate it. You can find plenty more. Well, let me return to the main point. We can now, if we're interested in the realities of U.S. government commitment to human rights, there's two courses. We can take that commitment to be given so that moral, and we can also assume that elementary moral considerations are irrelevant, or we can take the commitment to human rights to be a question of fact, and we can assume that moral considerations are relevant. Those are the two possibilities. Well, the first is near universal. Assuming that facts are irrelevant, it's just a given, and moral considerations are irrelevant. That's near universal, even in scholarship, I should say. So take as an example a very distinguished historian, Michael Howard. He was the Regius Professor of History at Oxford, later maybe still Professor of History at Yale. About 10 years ago, he wrote that for 200 years, the United States has preserved almost unsullied the original ideals of the Enlightenment, and above all, the universality of these values, although it does not enjoy the place in the world that it should have earned through its achievements, generosity, and goodwill. That's 200 years, a record of purity which is unsullied by the fate of the native population, by slavery, by the slaughter of a couple 100,000 Filipinos, let alone some more recent contributions. In fact, some going on in the very months that Howard was writing these laudatory words, which was right in the midst of the peak of atrocities in the U.S. wars in Central America in the 1980s. Sometimes this is taken to be not only a fact, but a principle. So the professor of the science of government, phrase I've always liked, at Harvard University, Samuel Huntington, wrote recently that alone among nations, the national I'm quoting now, the national identity of the United States is defined, notice the word defined, by a set of universal values, including liberty, democracy, equality, and then, various other good things. Since this is a matter of definition, facts are irrelevant. So if you define, 4 to be 2 plus 2, you don't carry out experiments to check it. This is a matter of definition. So we don't have to worry about the fact, since it's a matter of definition, say that the United States is committed to equality. We don't have to worry about the fact that inequality in the United States, at the time he wrote, was reaching historic levels, in fact, far higher than other developed societies, and that in the richest city in the United States, New York, it had actually achieved the level of Guatemala, which is the worst in the world, and incidentally long a U.S. dependency, not to speak of other examples that one can think of. Same is true in the media. In fact, the whole story is close to exceptionless. Coming specifically to human rights, as you know, every December 10th is Human Rights Day. That's the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN in December 1948. And there's usually a lot of editorials and so on. In December 1995, the New York Times editorial on Human Rights Day discussed Asian critics of the Universal Declaration who protest that it reflects Western values, not Asian values. But the editors reject this attack on the universality of the Universal Declaration, which the United States upholds as a self-evident truth. Okay, you don't have to provide evidence for that, and none is presented. The news columns, at the same time, discussed the recent meeting of the United Nations and I'm quoting, the mixed success that the United States had achieved at the UN meetings on human rights, which left American diplomats frustrated at the unwillingness of other countries to take tough public stands on human rights, and they're only paying lip service to the Universal Declaration and the United Nations Charter. I'll come back to the Universal Declaration, but the United Nations Charter, remember, rules out the use of force in international affairs, and about the same time, Madeleine Albright, now Secretary of State, had informed the Security Council, which was unwilling to go along with some U.S. actions against Iraq, informed the Security Council that the United States will act multilaterally when it can, unilaterally when it must, recognizing no constraints of international law, the UN Charter, the Security Council, or anyone else, when it decides its national interests are affected, in this case, in the Middle East, and incidentally unreported here within the mainstream. The U.S. has demonstrated the same attitude towards international law and the UN Charter and so on in numerous occasions, the most dramatic, I suppose, being the judgment of the International Court of Justice, the World Court decision, condemning the United States for unlawful use of force, that is, violation of the UN Charter, in its attack against Nicaragua, ordering it to desist and calling on it to pay reparations. That was just dismissed here as absurd, as the United Nations had discredited itself, the World Court had discredited itself by passing this resolution. Of course, the U.S. escalated the war immediately. The Democrat-controlled Congress reacted to the World Court judgment by increasing the funding of the war that the World Court had just ordered us to withdraw from. Reparations is obviously never discussed or considered, and so on. That's unfortunately pretty common. I should say in that case, Nicaragua went on to bring it to the Security Council. The Security Council passed debated a resolution not mentioning the United States, though everyone knew what was meant, calling on all states to observe international law. That's all it said. It was had one negative vote, veto. The United States vetoed it. Everyone else voted for it. It then went to the General Assembly, where the vote was, the United States again was the only vote against, actually Israel and the United States, but the Israeli vote is automatic. That's like Ukraine voting with Russia during the old days. So the United States and Israel voted against, everyone else for it. It came up the next year, again, the same result. None of this was reported, I should say, but that's illustrative of the commitment to international law that the New York Times editors or journalists are so excited about. Well, for the standard view, the view that facts don't matter and that commitments matter of principle and moral considerations are irrelevant, for that you can get ready for quite a flood next year. We're approaching the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, and it's pretty safe to predict that there's going to be quite a flow of impressive rhetoric about our principled commitment to human rights and everything else wonderful for 200 years, or, and the moral relativism of other bad guys and so on and so forth. The last time this happened was reached a crescendo, the standard view, at the 1993 Vienna Conference on Human Rights. There, well, quote the headline in the New York Times, U.S. insists rights must be universal. New York Times front page headline, reporting that the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, who they say promoted human rights in the Carter administration, come back to that, was leading the defense of the universality of the Universal Declaration against relativists from Asia and against the world's aggressors and those who encourage the spread of arms. It's quoting the New York Times. Unmentioned is the fact that the United States was then far and away the leader in arms sales to the Third World, most of them to brutal dictators of one or another kind, policies which are accelerated under Christopher, under his tenure at the State Department, and happen to be opposed by 96% of the population here, but they're strongly supported by high technology industry, which, is one of the ways in which the public funds their activities. Also not reported is that the United States is far in the lead since the 1960s in vetoing Security Council resolutions against aggression, human rights violations, calling on states to observe international law, as I mentioned. Often these resolutions are directed against the United States. Very little of this is ever reported. It's often explicitly denied, so you read over and over again that it was the Soviet veto that blocked the United Nations until 1989, Actually, the Soviet Union, since the 1960s, was fourth in vetoes, the United States first, Britain second, France a very distant third, Soviet Union fourth. Still unreported, outside of the Journal of the American Society for International Law, is the fact that at the Vienna conference, quoting, the United States officially stated that foreign invasion does not constitute a human rights violation. Pretty wise decision when you look at the facts of the world. Also unexamined is the question of how Warren Christopher was promoting human rights under the Carter administration, when, for example, it stepped up the flow of arms to Indonesia in 1978 at the peak of the atrocities, and a fair number of other cases. I might mention, since I'm talking about coverage, that in the case of East Timor, there was quite high coverage in 1974, before the Indonesian invasion. That was in the context of concern over the collapse of the Portuguese Empire. When the invasion took place with U.S. diplomatic and military support and the atrocities began, the coverage began to decline. By 1978, when they peaked with maybe a third or a quarter of the population killed, and the Carter administration sent new aid, the coverage declined to flat zero, both in the United States and Canada, not one word. However, I'm straying here to the second approach to the topic, that is the one that assumes that facts matter and that we should respect moral truisms. Let me continue with the standard view, which rejects the relevance of facts and elementary moral considerations. So let's go back to the Vienna Conference, which is the same thing is going to be replayed next year, so might as well look at the last one. There was a huge amount of media coverage, full of praise for the United States for its principled stand at Vienna, and it reported finally that the challenge of relativism was beaten back, and the Vienna Conference declared that the universal nature of the rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Universal Declaration is beyond question, quoting, though outside the United States and its allies, adherence to this declaration is only rhetorical. That's the New York Times. Okay, that's the standard view, again, reiterated very loudly in this case at Vienna. Now let's take a look at the non-standard view, okay, and look more closely at the facts. So let's begin with the Vienna Conference. Actually, there's an easy way to look at the facts there, because there was a counter-conference at Vienna. It was organized by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, an old human rights group, I think goes back to the First World War, and a whole collection of NGOs and church groups and other groups from third world countries and around the world. They ran a conference at Vienna too, which was strikingly different from the official one, in that it wasn't just empty rhetoric, but there was a lot of facts. They were following the second course. And they published a book about it, an interesting book, and since we live in the free world, the book exists. They were able to find a publisher in Kathmandu in Nepal who published 2,000 copies of it, so if you happen to find yourself there, you might be able to pick one up. One of the advantages of being in the free world. Incidentally, I mentioned earlier that there are lots of opportunities outside of governmental channels. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is a good example of one, and this was a major effort. Maybe this was reported in the Austrian press. I guess it probably was, although I didn't check, but it was certainly not reported in the American press. Or we can look at, say, a wire service report on the meeting of the UN Human Rights Commission, the most recent one just a year ago, unpublished here to my knowledge. The headline of the report is UN Rights Chairman Slams Washington Hypocrisy. And it opens by reporting his bitter condemnation of the West, United States in particular, for condemning abuses in some states, particularly Islamic states, while letting political or economic allies literally get away with murder. Let me add my own gloss to that. The United States and its associates not only lets its allies get away with murder, but it also assists them enthusiastically and frequently leads the way itself, themselves, because it's not just us. Secondly, the condemnation of the Islamic world happens to be rather nuanced. In fact, it's guided by the same delicate judgments that hold elsewhere and the same principles. So take the most extreme Islamic fundamentalist state in the world with a terrible human rights record, namely Saudi Arabia. But it's been a U.S. client, loyal U.S. client since its origin, so it escapes censure. And it doesn't fall under the plague of Islamic fundamentalism. Or take, say, the biggest Islamic state in the world by far, namely, also with a horrible human rights record, namely Indonesia. Well, that's enthusiastically supported by the United States ever since the staggering mass slaughter of 1975, which the leading liberal columnist in the New York Times, James Reston, called a gleam of light in Asia. Time magazine called it the West's best news in Asia for years. U.S. News and World Report, hope where there once was none, and so on and so forth. So that escaped censure. So some Islamic states are fine, like the most extreme fundamentalist one and the biggest one, and in fact others, but some are not, and if you ask what makes them good or bad, the criterion has nothing to do with human rights violations. It simply has to do with obedience. That was, again, dramatically obvious in the case of Saddam Hussein, who was a major friend and trading partner right through the time when he was gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents and so on and so forth, but became an enemy, you know, the worst monster since Hitler, when he crossed the line and did something the United States didn't like, not because there were worse atrocities. Most of the worst atrocities had already happened by overwhelming majority, but made a mistake. Well, let's go back to the wire service report on the UN Human Rights Commission meeting. The report announced that Amnesty International had stated that it was going to call on the Commission to take action on 5 priority areas. The 5 priority areas are China, Colombia, Indonesia, East Timor, Nigeria, and Turkey. The United States tried to get them to put on Cuba instead, but it was unable to line up any support for that. In fact, the UN once again voted overwhelmingly, usual vote, 2 against, to denounce the call on the United States to call off its embargo against Cuba. Actually, to be precise, the United States got an extra vote that time. I don't know why. It was U.S., Israel, and Uzbekistan against the rest of the world. And so Uzbekistan has been an Islamic country since the 14th century, so somehow that also escaped censure, I suppose. Well, the 5 that the Amnesty International picked and the UN picked were China, Colombia, Indonesia, East Timor, Nigeria, and Turkey. Let's take a look at that list. The United States will permit only a very light slap on the wrist for China, Indonesia, Turkey, and Colombia. Colombia happens to be the worst human rights violator in the hemisphere. This is very extensively documented by human rights groups, even by the State Department Human Rights Report, church groups, and others, generally unreported here, just as it's unreported that Colombia gets close to half of U.S. military aid and training for the hemisphere, going up under Clinton. Human Rights Watch says going up again next year, going specifically to military units that have just been identified, implicated in human rights atrocities by the human rights groups. In this case, the pretext is the drug war. That's dismissed as a myth by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the church, and other knowledgeable observers for very good and well-documented reasons, which I will go into later if you like. Okay, out of the list, that leaves Nigeria, where sanctions won't fly, quoting the headline of a Wall Street Journal report, because embargo could hurt West. Okay, so that takes care of Nigeria. And the headline captures the operative principles on human rights quite accurately. Actually, most of this is kind of academic, I should say. The UN Human Rights Commission is unlikely to function anymore because it's being defunded. That's part of the U.S. effort to eliminate those parts of the United Nations that don't serve primarily U.S. economic and strategic interests, the method being to illegally withhold funds. There's a long list. Sometimes the timing is pretty impressive. So, for example, on June 1st, 1995, the American head of UNICEF gave a press conference in New York, the annual press conference, in which he gave a UNICEF report, that 13 million children a year are dying because the West won't give pennies of aid so that kids will have a little bit of salt or something like that. That's up from 11 million the preceding year. The head of the World Health Organization calls it a silent genocide, and silent is correct. On the same day, Congress slashed the support for UNICEF by a third. That's part of the radical cutback in U.S. foreign aid. United States foreign aid is by far the lowest relative to GNP in the developed world. It's long been the most miserly. Now it's going down to almost nothing. That's another tribute to the fabled generosity that Professor Howard described. Americans, fortunately, were spared this coincidence because the UNICEF press conference was not reported. Well, let's have a look at the Universal Declaration, which the U.S. defends with such impressive courage against the assault of Asian relativists, part of its unsullied commitment to Enlightenment values for 200 years. The Declaration was accepted unanimously at the United Nations on December 10th, 1948. It's accepted generally as a human rights standard, and indeed in U.S. courts, it's accepted now as customary international law, hence binding. The most famous article by far is Article 13. That's the one that reads, "Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own." The reason that's famous is that it was invoked with great passion every year, as long as the Soviet Union was around, on Human Rights Day, December 10th, with big public demonstrations led by Harvard law professors and other distinguished folk, with indignant demands that the Soviet Union live up to Article 13, which says that anyone can leave his own country, and let Russian Jews leave. Okay? So everybody knew this one. Big headlines every year, so on. Actually, I didn't quite quote the actual wording. Here's what the actual wording of Article 13 says. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. The significance of the omitted words, which have never once been mentioned to my knowledge, the significance of those words was spelled out on December 11th, 1948, that is the day after the Declaration was passed, in another unanimous resolution of the General Assembly, Resolution 194, affirming the right of Palestinians to return to their homes or receive compensations if they choose not to return. Now, that omission of those words was unreported, as was the fact that the most passionate opponents of Article 13 were the people exhorting the Soviet tyrants to observe it with much acclaim. I must say that took a good bit of discipline year after year to go through this without anyone breaking ranks. Well, the cynicism, fortunately, is now overcome. In December 1993, the Clinton administration at last joined Israel in opposing UN 194. It had always voted with the rest of the world for it. Until then, the resolution was reaffirmed 127-2, usual 2, unreported as usual, but at least there's no more inconsistency. The first half of Article 13 is now irrelevant, with the Soviet Union having departed, and Washington officially rejects the omitted words. Okay, that's Article 13. Turn to Article 14. Article 14 says, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. everyone, I presume, includes Haitians. 87 new victims were captured in Clinton's blockade and returned to the charnel house in Haiti as the Vienna Conference opened. The United States has in fact upheld Article 14 in this manner with respect to Haiti since the 1970s. The Duvalier dictatorship was a respected ally, helping to convert Haiti into an export platform for U.S. corporations looking for super cheap labor. Therefore, President Carter and his Warren Christopher supported human rights again, made a decision that they would simply force Haitian refugees back to the terror. Of course, that's illegal, but they would do it. That Carter practice was ratified in a Reagan-Duvalier agreement, an agreement that the U.S. naval forces and Coast Guard would force Haitians back into the horror chamber. When the military coup overthrew Haiti's first democratic government, President Aristide, in September 1991, renewing the terror, the Bush administration imposed a blockade to drive back the flood of refugees back to the torture chamber where they were to be imprisoned or killed, of course, and Clinton then maintained it and extended it, sending people back right when the Vienna Conference opened. Incidentally, again, all of this is completely illegal. I mean, you can imagine the reaction, say, if, I don't know, Libya or say, interdicted U.S. airspace. Imagine they had the capacity to close off U.S. airspace so no one could leave the United States. If anyone left the United States, they'd force them back. You know, I mean, not unimagine that that was happening if they were being tortured. No point discussing it. Well, Bush's appalling refugee policy, as Clinton called it, this appalling refugee policy of forcing them back, that was bitterly condemned by candidate Clinton, and his first act as president was to tighten the blockade, also extending Bush's decision to undermine the embargo against the military coup by exempting U.S. firms. Trade was high in 1992. It increased under Clinton, including purchases by the U.S. government, and in fact a large increase in export of food to the United States from the starving island. The crucial element of any embargo is oil. The day before the U.S. troops landed to restore democracy, the lead story in the wire services, hence one that no one could miss, was that a leak from the Justice Department revealed that the Bush and Clinton administrations had permitted the Texaco Oil Company to illegally ship oil to the junta, which meant there were no sanctions. That was suppressed, and it still has not reached the national media. In fairness, however, the United States did observe Article 14 for 7 months during the brief tenure of the democratic government in Haiti. At that point, the refugee flow from Haiti reduced to a trickle. Prior to that, of more than 24,000 Haitians who were intercepted by the United States from 1981 to 1991, of 24,000, 11 were granted asylum. At the same time, 75,000 of 75,000 Cubans were. In those years of terror, Washington allowed 28 asylum claims, accepting 11. During the 7 months of President Aristide's tenure, with the violence and repression radically reduced, 20 were allowed asylum from a refugee pool 1/50th of the scale. Practice then returned to normal after the military coup and the renewed terror, right to the moment of the Vienna Conference. All of it missed somehow in the coverage. Well, that's Article 14. Let's move on to Article 25. It reads, "Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control." You'll note the sexist language, but remember, this is 1948. It's unnecessary to dwell on the defense of these principles in the world's richest country, with a poverty level twice that of England, which has the second worst level record among the industrial societies. In the United States, about 30 million people suffer from hunger, not because of any shortage of food, certainly. That's up 50% since 1985. Poverty and hunger are particularly severe among children. In New York City, 40% of children are below the poverty line. That means the line below the level at which you can maintain a subsistence level of existence. That's in Boston, another rich city. In the late Reagan years, the Boston City Hospital, the one that serves poor people downtown, had to set up a malnutrition clinic for children for the first time ever, dealing with third world levels of malnutrition. Now they're afraid they may have to close it because funding is disappearing, and on and on. It's going to get much worse under what was called the welfare reform, which is in radical violation of Article 25. I think you can figure that out without any further comment. Given its unparalleled advantages, I think it would be fair to describe the United States as in the leading ranks of opposition to the universality of the Universal Declaration by virtue of this single article alone. Add that there's an international dimension to this. The World Health Organization recently pointed out that hunger kills more people every 2 years than the number of people killed in both world wars. And again, it's not because of shortage of food, it's because of social policies in which we certainly have a significant role. Sometimes it's direct, so the embargo against Cuba, which is the harshest in history, nothing remotely like it in any other case, that blocks food and medicine. It's flatly in violation of international law. In fact, it's repeatedly been condemned even by the international law group of the Organization of American States, which is usually very docile, and also by their Human Rights Commission. It has a very severe effect. The American Association of World Health just came out with a big study of the effects on nutrition and health. They describe children dying in agony in hospital beds because they can't get medicines, hunger. The only thing that's keeping the place going is a very good unusually good health system and rationing and so on. This is the one case of a country under severe starvation, close to starvation conditions, in which the only people who are really suffering are adult males, because the rationing system goes to the defenseless, to the women, and children, the elderly, and so on, exactly the opposite of what happens almost everywhere else. This we maintain, and that's a direct imposition of hunger and disease, quite purposeful. Well, let's go on to Article 23. Article 23 says everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment, along with remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. No need to tarry on this devotion to this principle. Without going on, the United States does not even pretend to uphold the social and economic provisions of the Universal Declaration, such as these, only the civil and political ones like Articles 13 and 14, and I mentioned how well those are upheld. There is, recall, no end of passionate denunciation of third world relativists with their Asian values who insist on such measures as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, which the United States alone has vetoed. The refusal to accept the rejection of these principles of the Universal Declaration, I should say, is official. The U.S. delegate to the ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission, Morris Abram, stated that they have no status. Jean Kirkpatrick, when she was our ambassador to the UN, was a little more forthright about it. She said they're like a letter to Santa Claus, not even a joke. But it's only the third world relativists who don't accept the universality, remember. The Universal Declaration also calls for action to uphold, to guarantee that the basic human rights are upheld. That means ratification of treaties, enabling legislation, and so on. The U.S. has one of the worst records in ratifying the enabling legislation, but occasionally it does so. However, every time it's done so, it has declared the treaty to be what's called non-self-executing, means inapplicable in U.S. courts, and no enabling legislation, so it can't be invoked. The ratification is an empty act for Americans. The Human Rights Watch and ACLU report on this concludes, again, with no coverage. Well, those exceptions are crucial. Going on with the Human Rights Watch ACLU report, it observes that the United States violates the treaties in important respects, giving many examples. For the example, the United States introduced a specific reservation to Article 7 of the Convention on Protection from Torture, because it states that on the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because Article 7 states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The U.S. took an exception to that one. The reason is the terrible conditions in prisons in the United States. The United States leads the world in imprisoning its population. Actually, it's probably right about China, same as China, since the Reagan years. It's increasing again. Those conditions, the conditions of imprisonment, violate Article 7 and also Article 10 on humane treatment of prisoners and the right to reformation and social rehabilitation, which the United States flatly rejects. Another U.S. reservation concerns the death penalty, an exception for which the United States is regularly condemned by human rights monitors and the UN Commission. Other international covenants submitted to Congress also are restricted to non-self-executing, including the Convention Against Torture and many others. I won't go on with this. It's exceptionless to my knowledge. The United States does defend free speech, uniquely so, in fact, and that's to the good. However, even there's some questions one might ask. In fact, the UN has asked them. The UN Human Rights Commission criticized the United States for allowing money to be considered a form of speech, something which, as they pointed out, undermines the political process, which is quite reasonable, I believe. Well, all of this continues. I won't go on with any more details. Let me turn to one last example, just to illustrate how these things work. As I mentioned, the United States does not consider aggression to be a violation of human rights, so announced at the Vienna Conference. But terrorism the United States does regard terrorism as a human rights violation. Or does it? Well, it's worth a careful look. There is one major UN resolution on terrorism at the United Nations, December 7th, 1987. The resolution considers terrorism in all its forms to be a crime and condemns them, and it outlines measures to combat terrorism in all its forms. The resolution was passed 153 to 2, with one abstention. Honduras was away that day. The two were the usual two, United States and Israel, which opposed the resolution. Why did the United States oppose the UN resolution condemning terrorism? Well, here's the reason. One paragraph of it states the following: the resolution does not prejudice the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence of peoples forcibly deprived of that right, particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation, and the right of these people to struggle to that end and receive support in accord with the UN Charter. Okay? Well, the U.S. does not support that right, the right of self-determination, the right to struggle for freedom and independence against racist and colonial regimes and foreign occupation. So therefore, the United States voted against the resolution, which amounts to a veto. I mean, technically, there's no veto in the General Assembly, but if the toughest guy on the block votes against the resolution, it's vetoed in effect. I might mention that the record in the General Assembly is very much like that in the Security Council. The U.S. is way in the lead in near isolated votes against in the General Assembly on all sorts of topics. The United States does protect freedom of speech, as I mentioned, and that's a very good fact about the U.S., recent, incidentally, since the 1960s. That includes, however, the freedom of the corporate media to suppress the wrong kind of information. There are some pretty dramatic cases. In fact, I'll mention just one involving terrorism. One's coming up right now. The Oklahoma City trial is just underway. At the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, there was quite properly bitter condemnation of whoever did it. First, they didn't know who did it. It was assumed it was some Middle East source. And there were big headlines saying Oklahoma City looks like Beirut. There were lots of calls to bomb any Middle East country that might be involved in this atrocity. Clinton said he would go to the ends of the earth to punish them, and so on. And the analogy of Oklahoma City to Beirut was made over and over again. Beirut is coming to right this heartland of America, real atrocity. It is, I agree with that. However, Beirut has looked like Beirut for a long time. In particular, exactly 10 years before the Oklahoma City bombing, the biggest car bomb in history went off in Beirut, very parallel to Oklahoma City. It was timed, it went off outside a mosque, timed to kill as many people as possible as they were leaving the mosque, killed mostly women and children. It was a very big bomb, so, killed people in apartment houses nearby, and so on, killed about, nobody knows, but about 80 people, about 250 wounded. Very similar to Oklahoma City. In this case, it's not very hard to find the perpetrators and to punish them, at least if the U.S. Air Force has the capacity to bomb California, Texas, Washington, and leave a few bombs left over for London. The bombing was carried out by the CIA and British intelligence. It was aimed at a Muslim cleric, Sheikh Fadlallah, who they missed, just got these other people instead. All of this is well known to the media and other commentators. Actually, I personally brought to the attention of a great many people in the United States and Britain the striking parallel between Oklahoma City and the Beirut bombing. At the time of all this furor, there was zero coverage in the mainstream. One usual maverick was willing to write about it outside the mainstream. That's quite typical and quite revealing, I think. In the West, Western state terrorism is indeed extensive. This is one case, well studied, but it's basically irrelevant. It's unmentionable. It's not a story. So it happens in Oklahoma City, an atrocity. When we do it in Beirut, exact same thing, exactly 10 years earlier. It's a kind of minor tale, which was of no interest. That's, again, typical, and it reflects the same criteria. Well, let me return to the general question of the U.S. commitment to human rights. We have the choices that I mentioned at the outset. You can simply adopt the conventions, say you can decide that facts are relevant and that elementary moral principles apply. These paths lead in very different directions, not only in the United States, of course. The choices that are taken are perhaps among the few near universals in the study of history and the intellectual culture, everyone's. For us, given the vast array of opportunities before us, we can begin to make use of them in a sensible and constructive way if we're willing to take the second path, to assume that facts are relevant and moral considerations are relevant. If we do that, we'll discover things that are not too pretty to look at, maybe painful, but have the advantage of being real and also correctable, offering ways to constructively improve the human rights climate, not only here, but elsewhere as well. Thanks. The mic over there, right in the center, if anybody wants to speak. Against Iraq or against Iran? Iran. Iran. Iraq. Yeah, okay, I wasn't sure which one you meant. Yeah, I couldn't hear the last consonant, I'm sorry. The sanctions against Iraq? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I have to look at the framework a little bit, which is important. As I mentioned, through the worst of Saddam Hussein's atrocities, the United States was supporting him. In fact, supporting him so vigorously that when Iraq bombed an American warship in the Persian Gulf, killing, I think, 37 American soldiers, the U.S. didn't even protest. That's unusual. It was a very strong supporter of Saddam Hussein. This went on right through the worst atrocities, the gassings, the torture, the whole story. Right into early 1990, the United States was sending him aid, very rarely reported. It was one of the biggest recipients of U.S. agricultural exports and others. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein made a mistake. The U.S. had let him know that it didn't mind much if he sort of rectified the border with Kuwait and shook a fist at the other oil producers to try to get them to raise the oil price. The U.S. would tolerate that. But he misunderstood. One of the problems of being a brutal dictator where anybody's afraid to talk to you is you get a funny picture of the world. You don't understand how it works. So he went too far. He took over all of Kuwait. In fact, what he did was virtually identical to what the United States had done in Panama a couple of years earlier. The U.S. took over Panama, killed roughly the same number of people that he killed in Kuwait, then installed a puppet government and pulled out. That's exactly what the U.S. assumed Saddam Hussein was going to do. So you look at the Colin Powell and the rest of these guys, their big fear was that Saddam Hussein was going to pull out of Kuwait, leave a puppet government, and the thing would be over, duplicating Panama. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted to use this as an opportunity to establish very firmly U.S. power in the region and tell everybody, well, George Bush said it best, in the middle of the bombing of Iraq, he said, defined the New World Order in simple words. He said, it means what we say goes, okay? Well, in order to show everybody that, it's good to have a, little demonstration. You can't really call what happened a war. A war is something where two sides shoot at each other. This was a thing where one side shot at the other from a very safe distance with overwhelming firepower. It was a conflict between the world's two leading military superpowers and a more or less defenseless third world country, which turned out the way you'd expect. But it was a show of force. Okay, the U.S. blocked all negotiation offers, made sure it took place. Immediately afterwards, Saddam Hussein turned to his next task, which was slaughtering. There was an uprising, big uprising in Iraq to try to get rid of him. Two, in fact. There was a Shiite uprising in the south, which happened to be right under the eyes of Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf and the U.S. troops. Rebelling Iraqi generals pleaded with the U.S. forces just to allow them to use captured Iraqi equipment to try to overthrow Saddam Hussein. That was refused. Everything was refused. Saddam Hussein put down the rebellion with real violence. There was not a peep in the West. After that, there was another rebellion in the north, the Kurdish rebellion. Again, Saddam Hussein put it down with extreme violence, but here the reaction in the West was a little bit different. Journalists went there, television reporters and so on, and they reported what indeed is true. You watch teary-eyed reporters saying, look, they're killing little children with blue eyes and blonde hair just like ours, which in fact is true. They're Aryans, and somehow that seemed to make a difference. So it was necessary. The Shiites are just kind of dirty Arabs. Nobody cared much about that. But these people were, blue-eyed and blonde-haired and all that kind of business. So there was a necessity to put a rather fraudulent support for the Kurds in the north. After that came and the reasons for this were explained quite frankly. It was that the United States preferred what was called stability. And stability meant keeping Saddam Hussein in power. Anything else would destabilize the region. In fact, Bush was praised for that by New York Times and everyone else. As the New York Times put it, the United States wants an iron-fisted Iraqi junta in power which will rule Iraq the same way Saddam Hussein did. That's what they said. They didn't like Saddam Hussein. It was kind of embarrassing at this point, but a clone. That was the idea. Meanwhile, we preserve stability, we support him while he puts down the uprisings. Okay, after that come the sanctions. The sanctions they don't affect Saddam Hussein. He's probably more powerful than he was, but they do affect the population. The scale at which and of course they affect the defenseless among the population. So children, women, old people, and so on. Iraq had a health system and rationing and so on, but couldn't survive this. The current estimates by Western, I should say U.S. medical research teams that have gone there is that about 500,000 people have probably died since the sanctions, and that goes on. So that's the sanctions. Saddam Hussein doesn't mind in power, and nothing is changing that. The reason why the United Nations doesn't go along with that, which is what led to Madeleine Albright's statement, is that most countries regard this as internal U.S. politics. They don't consider it to have much to do with international affairs. Europe, for example, regards it that way, which is probably accurate. Well, those are the sanctions. You can draw your own conclusions about them, but that's what they are. The First Amendment? Free speech altogether? I don't really think so. Yeah, I mean, that could be argued, but I think if you look at the history, it's probably not true. Actually, I think this, like I say again, this is one of the best things about the United States. In fact, it's about the only country I know of that protects freedom of speech. I mean that literally. Let me tell you what I think the reason is. Well, look, first of all, we have to look at the history, because the facts are important. The United States did not protect freedom of speech until the 1960s, even legally. Up until 1964, the United States still had a law of seditious libel. A law of seditious libel is a law that makes it a crime to assault the state with words, okay? Now, you take a look at any standard legal textbook on freedom of speech, say Harry Calvin's History of Freedom of Speech in the United States, kind of like standard work. He points out correctly that a law of seditious libel is the hallmark of a freedom of speech. If you have that law, you don't have freedom of speech. Well, that goes right back to, 1798 and so on. And it was applied. Like repeatedly in what were called times of crisis, the United States clamped down very harshly on freedom of speech. And that continued until 1964. The United States was not different from other industrial countries up until then. In 1964, something important happened. The Supreme Court struck down the law of seditious libel. It said you can assault the state with words. That broke through an important barrier. How did it happen? Well, it happened in the course of the Civil Rights Movement. That, in fact, was it was a case brought by the state of Alabama against the New York Times, because the New York Times it was called, if you look it up, Alabama versus New York Times. The New York Times had published an ad, not a statement, just an ad by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, in which they described the sheriff of, I think it was Birmingham, who was carrying out all kind of atrocities, and they just described the facts. Well, Alabama sued the New York Times for assaulting the state of Alabama with words, okay, namely describing the actions carried out by the Birmingham County Sheriff or whatever. And that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down the law, which granted freedom of speech officially in the United States. In 1969, there was another case, just to show how ambiguous these kings can get. This one involved the Ku Klux Klan, not the Civil Rights Movement. The Klan brought a claim that had been shut up, or, forcefully suppressed, and they brought a claim to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court reached a decision, which in my opinion is sort of the right one. It was the one proposed by Jeremy Bentham about, 1800, that said that speech should be free up to participation in ongoing criminal activities. Like, for example, if you and I walk into a store and you have a gun and I say shoot, that's not covered by freedom of speech, okay? But essentially anything short of that is covered by freedom of speech. That was a 1969 case. This one in defense of the Klan, the first one in defense of the Civil Rights Movement. Well, these things aren't necessarily, it's the way life is. But that was I think at that point the United States hit a real appropriate standard for freedom of speech, and I think it's unique. But if you look at the history, I don't think it's true that it was taken for the kinds of reasons that you suggest, although that's, it's kind of plausible. But I think if you look at the history, it doesn't work that way. None, really. But they don't feel any necessity. First of all, they're not called to account. I mean, there were cases where I actually have tried to do it. The bombing of Laos, for example, is something I was very much involved in personally as well. I was there, interviewed refugees, all sorts of things. Back in the late 60s, this big ferment, student movement, all this kind of thing, the press wanted to have somebody they could talk to from that group of crazies, just so they'd have some contact with it. And I look sort of respectable, wear a tie, talk quietly, that kind of thing. I wasn't going to throw any stones at them, that kind of business. So I was invited to editorial meetings at the New York Times and Time Life and that sort of thing. I kept bringing this up, why aren't you reporting the bombing of Laos, which is a horrible bombing. I mean, there's plenty of people still dying from it, bombs all over the place made by Honeywell, Marv David points out to me. It's true, probably millions of them still around blowing up. One of them just went off a couple days ago, killing 7 children. They just said, no, they're not going to report it. And, okay, nothing much you can do about it. Psychology? Well, actually, I mean, people differ, so you can't really generalize. But I think the general thing is something that we all know from our own experience. I mean, unless take your own personal experience. I mean, unless you happen to be an unusual kind of saint, maybe the first one since Jesus or something, unless you're that kind of person, you've done some rotten things in your life. Like maybe when you were 8 years old, you took a toy from your younger brother because nobody was looking, okay? Well, just go back to that circumstance or something similar to it and ask yourself honestly, did you say, I'm taking the toy from my little brother because I want it and I'm bigger than he is and nobody's looking, so I'll take it? Or did you say, look, it's really my toy, and besides he had no right to it, and besides I need it more than he does, and anyhow it's better for everybody if I have it, Okay, well, like I say, unless you're a saint, you took the second way out. And furthermore, anybody in their lifetime has had 1,000 experiences like that. Well, I think that's the way things work. you have some, it's not that I mean, belief formation is often contingent on the outcomes that you want. You want a certain outcome, you construct a system of beliefs which makes that exactly right and just. I suspect that that's the psychology in most of these cases. If you're an editor or a journalist or a professor or something or other, there are some things you want, like prestige and respectability and salary and invited to the right parties and all that kind of thing. And if you want to get that kind of stuff, you have to see things in certain ways. Okay, so you start seeing things in those ways, just like you did with your little brother, My guess is that's probably overwhelmingly the psychology. I don't think many people are cynical enough to be just flat outright liars saying I'm going to lie because that's the way they'll pay my salary. That's, but people differ. So your guess is as good as mine. I have nothing to say about this. The only thing we know about these kinds of things are from introspection, and I suspect that what I'm describing is pretty close to universal. I did take a toy from my younger brother when nobody was looking. The one on torture that I meant, the inhuman and degrading, well, it's just a general thing about prisoners being given humane treatment, having the right of, that doesn't talk about prisoners of war, that's internal prisoners, like the prisoners in your own society. Actually, the United States has condemned quite a lot for this, also by Human Rights Watch. One of the condemnations of the United States actually also involves Article 8 of the Constitution, the one against cruel and cruel and inhuman punishment or something like that. That has to do with the sentencing laws. The United States has extremely strange, well, not strange, but unusual sentencing laws. I think they're explicable. So, for example, there's a big report of Human Rights Watch that came, the major human rights monitor that came out recently about U.S. sentencing provisions. It dealt specifically with New York State, but it's general. In New York State, and this is quite general, the sentence for being found with possession of marijuana is the same as for rape of a child, burning down a house to try to kill 10 people, and a whole bunch of other crimes. Those crimes are the same in terms of sentencing as having some marijuana in your pocket. Well, this is Human Rights Watch and civil liberties groups condemn this as a violation of Article 8 of the Constitution, but also the Universal Declaration, which calls for appropriate sentencing for crimes. Now, possession of marijuana, whatever you think about it, it doesn't harm anyone. In fact, the fact is it doesn't even harm the person who uses it much. It's probably no worse than having a cup of coffee as far as medical evidence is concerned. But but in any event, it certainly doesn't harm anybody else, On the other hand, say smoking a cigarette, that does harm other people, and there's no crime for that. In fact, if you look at the sentencing provisions, they're very striking how they work. You may notice this morning the Supreme Court refused to accept a case on discriminatory sentencing provisions. This is from the sentencing, the judges who set up the sentencing project in Washington to try to set sentences have argued for a revision in the law because the penalties for powder cocaine for crack cocaine are 100 times as high as for powder cocaine, though it's the same effects and everything else, but it's a class and race difference. Powder cocaine is what you'd use in the rich suburbs, when you come back from the stockbroker's office or whatever it is. Crack cocaine is what they use in the black ghetto, and the sentences are 100 times as high. That runs across on all sorts of things. So the major cause of the major kind of killing of people in the United States, I mean, there's straight homicide, but the one that ranks right alongside it is driving under the influence of alcohol. That's about the same as homicide, the number of deaths. Driving under the influence gets extremely low penalties. The penalty for possession of drugs is about, I think, 20 times as high or something like that as driving under the influence. Well, just look at who's picked up. Driving under the influence, about 90% whites. Okay. drugs, the ones they pick up, are overwhelmingly blacks. Not because they use drugs more. In fact, they use drugs at about the same level as whites. But the laws and the police procedures and so on are directed mainly against the poor communities, black communities. So these are radical violations of conventions that call for equality of sentencing, appropriateness of sentencing, relation of a crime to the way you're treated, and so on and so forth. And the U.S. is repeatedly condemned for that. We're kind of off the map on this one. So at the crime level in the United States is not unlike other industrial countries, contrary to what people believe. The United States is kind of toward the high end, but not over the limit. The only exception to this is killings with guns. On this, the United States is kind of off the map, but that's because of our gun laws, which nobody else has. So in other countries, if people get mad at each other, they, punch each other or something. Here they take out an assault rifle and kill everybody in sight. So there are differences in that. But in other crimes, the United States is pretty much like other industrial countries, kind of toward the high end. On the other hand, and it was in incarceration too. You go back to 1980, the percentage of the population in prison was roughly like other industrial countries, again, toward the high end. Since 1980, it's gone out of sight. The U.S. passed South Africa, passed Russia. It's now competing approximately with China for, nobody knows the exact Chinese figures, so it's a rough estimate, but it's far out of line with any industrial country, and it's mostly drugs, including possession. And it's mostly aimed at what are called the dangerous classes, poor people, black people, that kind of thing. In fact, the percentage of blacks from cities in prison in major cities like Washington and so on, last figures I saw, was about twice as high as the proportion of Russians in the Gulag at the peak of Stalin's last years. Pretty astonishing. There's plenty of stuff in the criminology literature about it. Well, it's pretty hard to reconcile these things with the international conventions or even the Constitution. By far. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, let's take a simple one, a political assassination. Okay, that's one. In Colombia, there are about 10 people a day killed for political assassination. Okay, nobody even comes close to that. Colombia is very highly praised as a democracy here. And that's, Clinton tells you a great democracy and all that sort of thing. Well, it's a democracy. It actually even allowed an opposition party in 1985. Since 1985, 3,500 activists from the opposition party have been murdered by the state security forces and the paramilitary forces associated with them. That includes presidential candidates, mayors, organizers, and so on. But it's a democracy. Like they have elections where you don't rob too many votes. So you kill 3,500 members and wipe out the one opposition party. That doesn't prevent it from being a democracy. Well, those things are human rights violations. There are plenty of others. Colombia has a policy which they call social cleansing. That means you take undesirables. They're called disposables in Colombia, disposable people. And you send the police and the military and the paramilitaries out to kill them. That is like children who are begging in the streets, or homosexuals, or prostitutes, or anybody you don't like. People whose attitudes you don't like, or whose lifestyle you don't like, or maybe they're, whether they're forced into it or not, you get rid of them. Actually, we have a policy like that too. It's called jailing. Our policy of throwing people in jail at an unprecedented level is a kind of a counterpart to Colombian social cleansing. There they kill them, we're more civilized, we throw them into jail. And we can run through a long list. The targets of this, well, I guess the most neutral report, the most pro-Colombian report you can find is the State Department Human Rights Report. Amnesty International, the church, the Colombian church groups, the Human Rights Watch, they're much more acid about it. But take the least critical one there is, the Human Rights Watch report, which is trying to cover up. I'm mostly quoting them right now. And they also point out that The targets are usually peasants, teachers, human rights activists, workers, undesirable people, organizers, political activists, and so on. Well, those things are human rights violations. I don't care what criteria you use. Extreme human rights violations. And in those, Colombia happens to be, at the moment, far and away, in the 90s, far and away the worst in the hemisphere. It was much worse in El Salvador, let's say, in the 1980s. That's, of course, right here that happened, not there. Colombia, it's more indirect. They're doing it. We're just training them and sending them the arms. The State Department agrees with the independent monitors that the killings are, I think they attribute about 2/3 of the killings to the paramilitaries and the military, which is basically the same group. Like I said, the pretext is drugs, but about 2% are involved in drugs, something like that. Those are human rights violations. I mean, there are standards on human rights, like the Universal Declaration, and I think they're pretty good standards. Who should not be imprisoned? Well, if we want to imprison people for crimes, the worst crimes are white-collar crimes. So corporate crimes are way beyond anything like this, and those people aren't in prison at all. I don't particularly think they should be, like I'm not saying they ought to be in prison, but certainly things like possession of marijuana shouldn't be a crime. In fact, the U.S. agrees with that. If you look at the history of, say, take marijuana, it's very revealing. The peak use of marijuana in the United States, peak use, was in the late 1970s. Incarceration was at the lowest level in the 1970s, although it was technically illegal. Then the use of marijuana started to go down and incarceration started to go up for possession of marijuana. Same laws. What happened? Well, think about it. Who was using marijuana in the late 70s? White, middle-class, white kids who are sons and daughters of lawyers and doctors and that kind of people. You don't throw those people in jail. I mean, for them you have rehabilitation and education and pat on the wrist and so on and so forth. So the use of marijuana peaked, but the incarceration plunged. In the 80s, something happened among educated sectors of the population. There started in the early 80s, a decline in the use of any kind of substance. Marijuana, cocaine, liquor, tobacco, red meat, anything. All of this stuff started to go down. And you all know the reasons. You live in the middle of it. But it didn't go down among poor sectors. In fact, it stayed sort of stable. So when you called the drug war around late 80s, it was obvious from the trend lines that you were going to pick up poor black people. Okay? And that's when the harsh penalizing began. This was recognized at the time. It was pointed out right at the time, way up high. Remember Daniel Moynihan making a speech in the Senate that these decisions are simply criminalizing poor people, mostly black people. Yeah, that's what they were. So whatever this stuff is about, it doesn't have anything to do with crimes. Now, what should you do with people? If you're seriously interested in crime, you treat it the way it's treated in most countries. The United States is extremely rare in treating crime as a political issue. In the other industrial countries, candidates don't stand up saying, I'm going to be tougher on crime than you are. That's a U.S. thing, in fact, a rather recent U.S. thing. In most countries, it's treated as a problem. Okay? So you try to figure out how to deal with it. It involves the conditions that create crime, okay? The best ways of dealing with people who have committed crimes, rehabilitation, education. I mean, take, say, drugs. It's well known, study after study shows that educational programs are far more effective than criminalization programs. Okay. In fact, the drop in the trend lines that I just mentioned shows it, but very little money goes into that, goes into criminalization. These are social policies designed to get rid of, to control the dangerous classes. That's the standard term used in the criminological literature. They haven't got much to do with punishing people. Also with frightening everybody else. So like fear of crime is enormous in the United States, even though crime is more or less like other countries. Well, yeah, it's a way to control the rest of the population by frightening them. Social policy, after all, is directed for the last 20 years or so to harming the majority of the population. Like around maybe 80% of the population in the United States has seen their incomes either stagnate or decline for about 20 years, while a tiny sector is getting super rich. It's becoming to look kind of like a third world country. Well, that makes people unhappy, you know, and you don't want them to look at who's getting, you know, who's responsible. What you want them to do is look somewhere else. And there aren't a lot of ways to do that. Everybody hits on the same ways, usually get people to hate each other and be afraid of each other and, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's the way our propaganda system works too. I mean, you know, that's Willie Horton and Ronald Reagan's fraudulent welfare mothers and all that kind of stuff, okay? It's standard. Every propaganda system works like this, and crime plays that kind of role for us. But if you're seriously interested in the problems, look at the problems. These things aren't aimed at the problems. Okay, could we have 3, since there are 3 people standing there? Okay, are you in line? I can't see. Yeah, okay, let's take 3, okay? Yeah. And I didn't get what you said after United Nations and yeah, I understand. I got everything except the last word. United Nations organization and set up. I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of problems with everything you can think of, but I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with the United Nations. The United Nations does not act independently. The United Nations acts insofar as the major powers allow it to act. Basically, the United Nations is more or less run by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It can do things within the framework of what they allow. Of the 5 members of the Security Council, 2 are automatic U.S., almost reflexively support the United States, Britain and Russia. France will make some noises sometimes, but it usually, mostly does, and China is kind of abstains. You know. So basically the U.S. runs the United Nations, almost, you know, overwhelmingly. So the main problems about the United Nations go right back to Washington. The United States simply will not allow it to operate. And if you look at the history of the United Nations, I think this is very obvious. The United Nations was set up right after the Second World War, 1947. Okay. At that point, U.S. control over the world was overwhelming. You know, everybody did what the United States said for quite simple reasons. Otherwise, they were going to be in bad trouble, like they were going to starve. Remember, the Second World War had wiped out everybody else, and the United States, it was a big shot in the arm. We ended the Second World War with half the world's wealth. Okay. Well, okay, everybody, virtually everyone in the United Nations was obedient. So it was an instrument of U.S. policy, and everybody loved it. You go back to the late 40s and the early 50s, everyone talked about what a marvelous organization it is, and it's just fantastic. You know, the Russians are the bad guys, we're the good guys, the UN does everything we told it to do. In the 1950s, that started to change. Why? Because decolonization was setting in. Decolonization was taking place in the 50s, and the UN was starting to be more representative of the world because the third world countries were coming in and they were becoming members of the UN. Furthermore, Europe and Asia were less subservient. They were recovering from the war. They started moving a little in their own direction. The United States started turning against the UN. By the 1960s, the UN was almost completely, it really was not obedient. And the U.S. turned radically against the UN. It still had it pretty much under control, but it turned radically against it. As I mentioned, ever since the 60s, the U.S. is way in the lead in vetoing resolutions and voting alone at the General Assembly and so on, and also in undermining UN activities. Well, by the 80s, this really got extreme. The United States simply decided to put the UN out of business, at least the parts that it didn't like. So the U.S. just started defunding it, not paying its bills. Well, of course, the UN can't function if they don't have any money, and the U.S. is the richest country, so given the usual fee schedule, it pays the most in, and it just stopped. Right now, it's eliminating parts of the UN that it doesn't like the UN Development Organization. Doesn't like it, down the drain. There was a UN organization that monitored transnational corporations. It gave, in fact, about the only information about transnational corporations. U.S. didn't like that, down the tube. UNESCO was following third world interests, goodbye. Probably the Food and Agricultural Organization will go, the International Labor Organization is very likely to go. It's even censured the United States, which is a bad thing to do. And in fact, the United Nations is being reshaped, so it supports U.S. interests. I should say that this is official. So, for example, you should read when the United States rejected Nicaragua brought a charge to the World Court against the United States, I mentioned. The United States withdrew from the World Court proceedings, and it has an official document. The State Department submitted a document saying why we're withdrawing from the proceedings, and it's worth reading. Here's what they said. This is pretty close to verbatim. It said, first, what it said is that in the late 1940s, when the World Court, which is part of the UN, was set up, the United States could count on most countries of the world to agree with us on the way things should be. They didn't say obey us. They said agree with us, which was true. Most countries in the world would, for the reasons I mentioned. But then it says, over the years, that's less and less true. Many parts of the world, they don't go along with the way we see things, and therefore the United Nations and its institutions, like the World Court, is no longer a reliable instrument of international law and policy, meaning it doesn't do what we tell it to do. So therefore, we are introducing a reservation which says that on interests of national security, we will not allow any responsibility to any jurisdiction to the World Court. The issue of national defense, I think they said. The issue of national defense, it said on domestic issues. It said on domestic issues, we will not permit any jurisdiction to the World Court. The domestic issue in that case was the U.S. attack against Nicaragua, okay? And since the world doesn't see things the way we do, the World Court is an inappropriate instrument, and therefore we withdraw. Okay, that's the reason. It just happened again a couple of weeks ago. Just a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you noticed it, but let me just add the last case, which was just happening now. Okay, the European Union brought to the World Trade Organization a complaint against the United States for violating international law and World Trade agreements by its sanctions against Cuba, which are now so strong that they attack other countries as well. Okay, that was going to come yesterday to the World Trade Organization. The United States withdrew from the negotiations with the clear understanding that if it ever got there, the U.S. would lose, and the reasons were exactly the same as in the World Court. Stuart Eisenstadt, the U.S. Clinton administration spokesman, said that Europe, here's what he said. He said, Europe is challenging a policy of the United States which goes back 3 decades, aiming to overthrow the government of Cuba, and they have no right to do that because that's a domestic issue of the United States. Okay, so therefore, no world agreements. Notice that the presupposition is that we have a right to overthrow the government of Cuba. Of course we have that right. That's a domestic issue here. And since the world doesn't agree, the world is out of line. Okay, and we do not accept World Trade Organization agreement on jurisdiction on this. This was just a couple of weeks ago. Did you hear a peep of protest? No. Did you hear a peep of protest about the World Court earlier? No. That's the problem that the UN is facing. It is not a reliable instrument of policy because it doesn't go along with the United States. That's a problem. It can't function without U.S. support. No, it's not a puppet organization. I didn't say that. What I said is it cannot function without the permission of the great powers, and the biggest of the great powers is the United States. So if, for example, the Security Council passes a resolution calling on all states to observe international law, and the United States vetoes it, as happened in the case that I mentioned, okay, UN is paralyzed. Doesn't make it a puppet organization. It just means it can act within the framework that's permitted by the great powers, and that means primarily the United States, because if somebody else tries to interfere, they don't have that degree of power. Well, first of all, you're not an ordinary American person. If you're here, you're a highly privileged American person who has, is literate and has free time and has education and has access to things and so on. The ordinary American person is a family where husband and wife are working 50 hours a week to try to put food on the table so they can get by tomorrow, okay? That's different. They don't have a lot of choices, but we do. Plenty of choices. However, I don't think, and I think your question is understandable, but I would suggest that you rephrase it. You should not be asking what's a reliable source. The only reliable source is your own judgment. You take anything that you hear from anywhere and you ask, why is it being put that way? What's the interest of whoever's putting it? That includes what I'm telling you now. And you treat it critically. Actually, you treat it the way you would if you were, let's say, a chemist working on a problem in chemistry. Somebody comes along with a proposal, they says, here's what I got in that experiment. You don't ask, what's a reliable source? You say, well, is it true? I'll replicate it, or I'll try it a different way, or I'll look at how you did it, and so on and so forth. Well, if you're privileged like us, you can do that with a lot of sources. In the case of the media, in the mainstream media, it's pretty obvious what they're doing. I mean, these are huge corporations whose market is other businesses, advertisers closely linked to state power. Well, it's perfectly obvious what kind of picture of the world they're going to present. But anybody else has their own interest, okay? So what you have to do is get things from other sources. There are many. You should look at a wide variety of sources. So the human rights groups, their sources, I mean, they've got their own biases, but they present material from another point of view. Church groups do it from another point of view. The business press does it from another point of view. It's often more accurate, I should say. The business press often presents news much more accurately. So the Wall Street Journal and Business Week and Fortune often present extremely accurate news. Part of the reason is that they can trust their audience. They don't have to propagandize them. Another reason is that their audience actually has to have a tolerably realistic grasp of the world because they got money at stake. So for those reasons, the direct reporting in journals like the Wall Street Journal is often extremely accurate. That doesn't mean you should sort of treat it like gospel, You got to look at it critically, but it's and if you want a different perspective, you can read the British Financial Times, which is the major journal in the world. The London Guardian has a weekly. There are critical journals here of various range, from mildly dissident ones like The Nation over to, say, Z Magazine, where I write mostly, which is much more critical. But every one of them you have to read critically. You don't ask, are they reliable? Because of course they're not. The world is a pretty complicated place. Nobody has a take on it, I mean, everybody has a point of view, and you sort of see things, you interpret things from your point of view, but there's no reason to believe that, it's not like an axiom system, so you can deduce the truth from it. It's not mathematics. And you just have to be critical and look at things from a wide range of perspectives. I mean, a lot of what I was just saying, for example, you could have read in, say, Z Magazine. Some of it you could have read in The Nation. Some of it you could have read in These Times. On economic issues, you can read it in Dollars and Cents. And in fact, there's a whole array of dissident publications. Much of what I was talking about you can get straight out of the human rights groups, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and church groups, and so on. On Columbia, most of it comes from church groups. There's some good books, but they're published by small alternative presses. There is a very good, in Colombia, for example, there's a very good peace and justice group, church-based, Jesuit-based. And they're very courageous people because that's dangerous stuff down there. You can get knocked off any minute. They come out with very good materials, and they circulate around here somewhere. And the same elsewhere. On some things, it's a lot harder. For example, on Timor, you know how the news came through finally? Through Australia. Australia, which is right next to Indonesia, there was a lot of concern and a lot of coverage. A lot of apologetics, but also critical coverage for a number of reasons. One reason is that Australia has a kind of a blood debt to Timor. In the Second World War, about 60,000 Timorese were killed by Japanese invaders while they were trying to protect a couple of hundred Australian commandos who were trying to prevent Japan from invading Australia. You look at the map, you'll see it. So, okay, 60,000 Timorese died defending Australia from a Japanese invasion. The way Australia is paying back this blood debt is by being in the lead of supporting the Indonesian invasion. And that grates on a lot of Australians. You know, there are a lot of people who remember that. That, and for other reasons, has made a lot of stuff come out there. And, you know, it's not so simple, but you can get information from Australia. And there are networks of people who interchange information, and it sort of mostly got that here that way in the 70s. Now a lot of it's done by internet. Okay, so you can get lots of information on things you want through internet connections very fast, like, say, the Australian press. There are plenty of ways to get lots and lots of information. It takes time, takes effort, takes critical mind, and so on. For most people, it's a luxury they can't afford. Life's just too hard, you know, and they're stuck with the tube. But for people like us, it's a luxury we can easily afford. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't think there's a simple criterion. I think it's a hard question, but I think there are some criteria that we can keep in mind. For example, if the people of a country favor the sanctions, chances are it's a good idea, okay? So in the case of, say, the sanctions against South Africa, they were supported by the overwhelming majority of the population. No doubt about that. Actually, the sanctions were barely applied. Since South Africa was an ally, the sanctions were mostly a fake, and all sorts of ways were found to get around them and so on, but they had at least a symbolic effect. And putting aside the fact that they weren't applied, a good reason for thinking that those were the right sanctions are most of the population of the affected country wanted them. Take, say, the sanctions against Haiti. Most of the population wanted those sanctions. They were pleading for them, in fact. The U.S. undermined them. So they never worked. But there was a good reason to believe that they were appropriate sanctions because most of the people wanted them. They wanted to get rid of this gang of torturers. They were willing to suffer eating a little bit less to do it. In the case of Iraq, that is not true. Most people don't want to see their children die and don't see the point of the sanctions because they're not attacking Saddam Hussein anyway. In the case of Cuba, the population is overwhelmingly opposed to them, absolutely overwhelmingly. I mean, in fact, we have Gallup polls from Cuba on these topics. In the case of Burma, it's kind of hard to judge because you have to make a guess as to what Burmese opinion is. But I think you should take as a guideline the targeted population. To the extent that you can, makes more sense for them to make the judgment than for us. And to the extent that it's possible, it's not easy, try to figure out what the affected population would like. I think that's a fair test. It's not the, don't mean to say that it's 100% accurate, but it's at least a good start.
We
In case you don't know Marv Davidoff, there's two special qualifications he has in increasing order of importance. One, he's the conscience of Minnesota and much of the country for a long, long time. And more important, he's my personal bodyguard. So